anyway, we recaptured Bumpy, and it ended up, it was just a massive leatherback. It was big then, was big when it was caught previously, but it had grown another several hundred kilos and surpassed the existing records for largest leatherbacks ever caught by the NOAA team. So this Bumpy weighed in at around 1,500 pounds, roughly. I think, what is that, somewhere north of 500 kilos.
Incredible.
So it was pretty stunning to see a turtle that big and doing so well. And it was, it was good to see a turtle come back.
Reassuring.
Reassuring to know that they're still surviving.
Welcome to Saving Wildlife with me, Sam Williams. This is where we get to hear from amazing conservationists about their life and work and all the incredible things they do to save wildlife. George, it's fantastic to be chatting. I've long followed your work with leatherbacks, a species that I've still not seen in the wild. Can't wait to. You've been working with these incredible beasts, and some of them are huge. You must have memorable encounters that you can tell us about.
I do. And it's really interesting how I sort of came full circle with leatherbacks, because my first encounter with a leatherback, because it was quite memorable, was in the Delaware Bay area when I was working as an undergrad on a birding project. We were studying migratory shorebirds and trying to understand this connection between shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. And horseshoe crabs lay this huge biomass of eggs along the coast of New Jersey and the Delaware Bay. And we were banding birds at night and tagging horseshoe crabs with conventional tags. And it was one of these early studies with Dr. Pete Myers, and I befriended a graduate student at UPenn. And he was trying to understand the metabolic efficiency of a horseshoe crab egg and what it meant for these birds and how many they had to eat. And at some point along the way, I stumbled across the carcass of a leatherback turtle. And at the time, I'd never seen anything like it before. I couldn't believe that turtles got that big. And this was a leatherback that had been hit by a boat. So that's a huge threat for these turtles. And its carapace was split in half and it was washed up on the beach. And for me, that was a formative moment, but I had no idea. Back then, I think I was probably 19 years old, maybe even 18, that things would come full circle, and I'd end up doing a career that focused on sea turtle conservation, with leatherbacks as one of our sort of most important species.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've talked with other conservationists who've had those same formative experiences from something quite negative, and how that has pushed them into the work, because you see perfectly in front of you like how dire the situation might be. But have you got a rosier one?
I have a much rosier one. So that was like my first encounter with a leatherback. And after that, I went on to work with them on nesting beaches in Costa Rica and tagged 46 of them out of Playa Grande, Costa Rica, with satellite tags, documenting their movements across the Pacific. And that was always special to see a leatherback on the nesting beach. A big female leatherback is really inspiring. She's giving birth and contributing to the population, and every turtle that comes up on the beach is a blessing. So, but I hadn't seen turtles swimming in the open ocean until I started working with the NOAA team here off California.
Right.
And we went out to start doing satellite tagging of Western Pacific leatherbacks using planes, spotter planes, and a capture vessel, and got to handle several turtles that were wild caught on the foraging habitats. But I'd never been in the water with a leatherback until last year, when we stumbled across one while we were releasing loggerhead turtles off the coast of Sodwana Bay in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And we had a film crew in the water, and I was standing with my phone trying to document the release of the last loggerhead, and my colleague released it. Her husband was the videographer, and she jumped in the water with him to watch it swim away, when all of a sudden a big female leatherback just popped up right next to them. Wow. And I was stuck with this situation where I had to decide whether or not I wanted to jump in the water too and see this leatherback, because I did have my mask and snorkel and fins, or film it and have that, to share with the team from South Africa. So I opted to do the latter and sat on the boat filming it, wishing that I was in the water. But in the end, we got amazing footage from the videographer, and the turtle came back and found the team again. So it made 2 passes, because it seemed almost curious about what was going on. And that was absolutely stunning. So that to have that opportunity was incredible. And then there was one other incident that happened, which was amazing. And when I was out working off the coast here with the NOAA crew, we encountered a turtle named Bumpy. It was a recapture. So this was a turtle that had initially been captured several years prior, and was given the name Bumpy because it had a deformation in its carapace from a ship strike that had healed, but it left a big bump in the carapace of Bumpy. So anyway, we recaptured Bumpy, and it was just a massive leatherback. It was big then, was big when it was caught previously, but it had grown another several hundred kilos and surpassed the existing records for largest leatherbacks ever caught by the NOAA team. So this Bumpy weighed in at around 1,500 pounds, roughly. I think, what is that, somewhere north of 500 kilos.
Incredible.
So it was pretty stunning to see a turtle that big and doing so well. And it was good to see a turtle come back.
Reassuring
to know that they're still surviving.
And so the mechanical part of my brain is thinking about the how does that work? How do you get an animal that big on a boat? Have you got special equipment? And then how do you get them off the boat? And how do you weigh them? How does that all work?
It's a super involved process, and the team's refining it all the time. So it's very bespoke, and it's just kind of over the years incrementally improved with little refinements and new technologies. So the way it's done typically is there'll be a spotter plane with several observers, and they're doing surveys, line transects for turtles. But when they spot one, and all that data is being recorded, and along with data about marine mammals,
you must see whales,
and sharks, whales, pinnipeds, even molas, because they're a good proxy species for
is that
sunfish.
Sunfish? Yeah, okay.
They eat
giant disc of a
giant
fish.
disc, and they're what we call jellivores. They predate on gelatinous zooplankton.
Okay.
So it's the same diet essentially of a leatherback. So they're often seen together.
Right. Okay.
And
so a jellyfish can be described as a gelatinous zooplankton?
Yes.
Is that okay? Right.
That's
okay. Just give me terms. These are all new to me because it's marine and it's a totally different environment for me. But I love the idea of that they are found in the same places as the turtles. So are they competitors then?
The turtles are there. So like all sea turtles are sort of ecological niche. They have kind of carved out their own ecological niches, and it's often linked to their prey. And so for leatherbacks, it's gelatinous zooplankton.
Right. Okay.
For green turtles, it's seagrasses. For loggerheads, it's sort of benthic stuff. Clams, crabs.
Okay.
For hawksbills, it's coral reefs and sponges. But out here off California, the turtles are coming. The leatherbacks are coming here to feed on zooplankton, which is gelatinous zooplankton, which is fairly abundant along the coast during post-upwelling periods. So we have a lot of winds come through. Surface waters get moved, nutrients come up from the bottom of the seafloor, and they're fertilized. At the surface by sunlight, and they grow like crazy. And a lot of predators are drawn to these areas. The whole food web comes in to eat.
Right.
And so here in the California current, we have a really strong upwelling system during certain times of the year, and that's when we time our leatherback work. And that, by the way, was the origin for our name, Upwell.
Upwell. Right.
When we founded Upwell, the concept of upwelling and the importance of upwelling kind of really resonated with what leatherbacks do in the open ocean, which is find these areas where there's patchily distributed ephemeral prey, but they're often around like ocean fronts or convergence zones or along areas where upwelling traditionally occurs. And these are fleeting periods of the year, but they're somewhat predictable, and we've started to kind of use those environmental covariates associated with upwelling systems as ways to predict when leatherbacks are likely to be in the area. You had asked me though about the capture. It's fascinating. It's a real team operation. So we have to kind of anticipate when the turtles will be here, and then hope that, because everyone's got busy schedules and we kind of people have to commit to a date. We never know for sure if they're going to be here, but we try to target a great window in advance, and then we hire an aviation provider.
Right.
And
so is it a special plane?
It's a special plane.
I've seen like the bulbous window so they can actually see down. Because in a plane you don't tend to look down. Right?
Yeah, so that's right. So we use a twin-engine, high fixed-wing aircraft, where you can see, kind of past the landing gear. So you have nothing to hopefully impede your view. And then we also have a belly window in some of these planes where we can have an observer lying on their belly and staring down.
Oh, wow.
So we've got multiple eyes on the water and a whole process where one person's taking data and 3 other people are looking for turtles, and then we have to, of course, account for the angle of inclination, or the angle of viewing angle from where we are on the plane.
Yeah, to calculate distance and where it is.
Right.
Wow.
We have a strip kind of below the plane that we follow, and then distance going out from as you move away from that strip, there's greater likelihood of error.
Right. Okay.
So anyway, the plane's up there doing the transects. We're in the boat below. And we have the boat's called the Shillinger, and it's a leatherback capture machine, and it's got a bow door that's specially designed that drops.
Yeah.
So we can use the hydraulics of the boat and the bow door to bring the turtle into the boat once it's been caught. But on the bowsprit, we have usually two crew members. One of them's holding a 13-foot pole with a big hoop net on it, and the net's attached with little clips, so it breaks away. It's a breakaway net. And once the plane spots the turtle, we're alerted, the captain of the boat's alerted, and we go into a chase mode.
Right.
So we approach the turtle slowly as it's sitting on the surface when it comes up to take a breath, and then we're lucky, we can get close enough that we can get a shot at trying to catch it with the hoop net, and that involves one of the two guys on the bow who's holding the net reaching way out and then dropping the net as the turtle's moving forward.
Wow.
Near the boat.
Your team have been great and shared some video of that, so we'll put video into the YouTube version. Of course, audio, you'll have to go to YouTube and see it there if you're listening on audio. But what strikes me there is, yeah, it's great if the turtle stays on the surface, but they live in a three-dimensional space, and they could just dive down and get. So that must be really tricky to catch them, isn't it?
And they do that all the time. So we're constantly. Sometimes these chases can last for quite a while, and so that's why it's so nice to have the plane. So the turtle dives, the plane kind of does a circle.
Yeah.
We know it's going to come up sooner or later, and they eventually respot it, and then off we go again. We're chasing it again until we finally get that net over it, and then we have another person who's standing back by the wheelhouse with a rope that's attached to the bag. They pull the rope off the clips, or the bag off the clips. The turtle's now enveloped in the net, and then we pull it around. Everybody's all hands on deck. We bring the turtle over to a side door, and then we have another crew member who lies down on the ground prone and ties a rope basically around the turtle's shoulders.
Yeah.
And then a little, and cinches it into a knot that we can then bring back around to the bow and hook the capstan up to, and use the hydraulics of the boat to bring the turtle in along with all of us pulling.
Right.
And then the most recent innovation we've done is we added basically a scale that's used to weigh cattle.
Right.
So into the deck. So every season we take the boat out for this purpose. It gets outfitted with a deck that's safe for the turtle, and that will minimize abrasion and friction, and then this scale, and then we have a little Bluetooth device that we can check in with the scale and get the automatic weight.
Wow.
So if you're not careful on the boat and you don't want to be weighed, you can be caught off guard
You're
standing on the scale. Yeah.
Great.
But so we get a weight, and then we use that information to assess body condition,
and
growth, and kind of. And often we'll see when we get out, we usually get turtles that are fresh, have just arrived, and so they're still, some of them are really fat, but others are just in the process of starting to put on weight.
Just arrived from being out in the Pelagic Ocean somewhere.
Right. Good question. So these turtles are coming from the nesting beaches in the far West Pacific.
Okay.
And they're linked to a mid-year, or we'd say summer in the United States, but a mid-year nesting population. And they're in the Solomon Islands and in Indonesia. There are several beaches that have two different populations. They're all West Pacific leatherbacks, but they're different nesting subpopulations. And during the winter, the turtles go south towards Australia and New Zealand. And during the summer, the turtles they'll go into the Coral Sea, but some of them, up to 50% or more, will go up into the North Pacific Transition Zone and then cut across the Pacific Ocean all the way to the United States. Some will linger off Hawaii for a while and may not go all the way to the U.S., but we'll often get turtles that will go all the way to California.
So is this an annual cycle, an almost annual migration that they're doing? They're going Solomon Islands, Indonesia, down to Australia, and then up to the States?
No, too discrete.
So some are going down to the Australasia, and some are coming up to
That's right, yeah.
And is it there's so much here. I love this. I've seen a stat that the Eastern Pacific, I guess, subpopulation, they've reduced by 97%. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so maybe even over that.
Really?
In the last 30 years, their populations declined by over 90. Certainly, like we estimate, like maybe even as high as 99%. But
Wow. Okay, we'll come back to that and the threats facing them and things. But I'm curious, they're ectothermic because they're
they're
reptiles.
ectotherms, but we call them facultative endotherms.
Okay.
Because they have several properties that are or several attributes that make them unique and almost like quasi warm-blooded, although they're not. But they're probably the closest reptile to a mammal.
So in a regular reptile like an iguana, they're dependent on the environment and sitting in the sun to get warm. I'm thinking back because I just spoke with Jen Miller from WCN, who was working with sea otters, and I was amazed to learn that they keep themselves warm by metabolism. They're just burning so much energy. And of course, that's different to whales, which keep themselves warm with blubber. So this is something different.
It's a combination.
They don't have blubber, do they?
No, but they have brown adipose tissue, and they kind of burn. And when that burns, it generates heat. So they can create heat from exercise, but not the same way mammals do.
Okay.
And they also have high thermal inertia. So their mass is very big relative to their body size, so their width and length. So they're really thick.
Right. Okay.
They're slow to lose heat, slow to shed heat, and slow to gain heat. But that kind of works to their advantage on long dives where they slowly get cool. Yeah. And then they come to the surface and they might bask for a while and then head back down.
Okay.
So that's they also have a lot of this brown adipose tissue and a lot of fat, which helps them. And so it's a combination of behavioral adjustments and physiology and unique mechanisms for dealing with oxygen storage that other turtles don't have. They have countercurrent heat exchangers, and where the warm blood coming from the heart is cooled warms the cold blood in the extremities, and vice versa. So you have all these features that have kind of make the turtle really unique. The leatherback turtle are really unique in the reptile world, and especially in the turtle world. There are no other turtles that can forage in waters as cold as the leatherback, or that move into realms that are as far north or south.
And deep as well.
And deep.
Isn't it? How deep do they, I'm kind of curious about the trivia. Like, how deep do they go?
Recently there was a dive of, I think, 1,340 meters recorded.
Wow.
And then some turtles
more than 1.3 kilometers.
1.3 kilometers deep. And the deepest one that I've seen from our tracks was about 1,210 meters.
Wow. And that's phenomenal pressure as well.
Yeah.
That they're then adapted to handling. And the adjustment in pressure, thinking of like scuba diving, how much work that is.
That's another mystery as to how they do that and why they do that and why they dive so deep.
Right.
But you can imagine when they're diving like that, they have this pliable carapace.
Yeah,
unlike
it's not a super hard shell, is it?
So we call them soft-shelled turtles, but they're not exactly soft either. But their carapace is made of these hexagonal bones. It's sort of a matrix of bones that can kind of compress. So as they dive, you could imagine they kind of get somewhat cigar-shaped, I would think, at depth.
Right.
And so they're kind of, basically get compressed and then expand again as they ascend.
Amazing.
And their dives can last, well over an hour on these really long dives. But we've tried a lot of teams have been exploring the nature of these really deep dives and why they do it. And there are different theories. One may be predator avoidance, but you'd need to see a really fast descent. And often these are long, sort of slow dives. Another theory is orientation. They're looking for crustal anomalies in the seafloor. But some of the places where they do these dives, the seafloor is so deep, it seems questionable that they'd actually pick up much, even getting a kilometer closer. And then another one might simply just be predation. So they're looking for prey, and then they can scan the water column as they ascend and look for jellyfish and zooplankton in that contrast with light coming down.
They are hunting with visual.
They're visual predators,
right,
and they also have chemical sense. They can smell, good olfactory sense as well. So chemosensory perception as well. At least we think there's a link there with like natal homing and finding nesting beaches. But they're certainly visual predators.
Yeah, interesting. Upwell is focused on all turtles, I believe. But there is a focus on leatherbacks in particular, or how would you describe the relative attention that you give to different turtles?
So we try to be fair, but I am biased.
You don't have a favorite, but you do.
We don't have a favorite, but we do. This guy, just because the inspiration for creating Upwell was driven in part by the plight of Eastern Pacific leatherbacks, where I'd been working on a project for many years. When I started my PhD down at Playa Grande, Costa Rica in 2002, there were about 185 nesting females at the nesting beach, and every year there were fewer and fewer. Maybe it was 165, but anyway, the numbers fell precipitously over the last 15 years, and we're down to like 2 to 3 turtles or less per season now. But it was an incredible drop off, and that sort of promulgated the realization that nesting beach conservation alone wasn't enough, nor in the goals of trying to achieve bycatch reduction, which is the kind of the biggest driver of decline, we think, for leatherbacks, and at least this population, is an incredibly Herculean and Sisyphean task right now. With so many, these animals move so far and wide, and this is like the tracking data revealed to us that they're scattered across the Pacific, and they travel tremendous distances, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from their nesting beach, and that's where they spend 99% of their lives. In fact, for males, their entire lives.
Right.
And the pressures are just great out there, and if we can't get countries to agree to bycatch reductions, and that's extremely hard. We can't get observer coverage on other fleets. We don't know how many turtles are being killed. There are a lot of bad actors. There's a lot of, on the high seas, there's no law whatsoever, and these turtles love the high seas. Yeah. So, boats, vessels are acting with impunity, and in a perfect world, it would be great to say, we'll just reduce bycatch, and the problem's going to be solved. We'll keep protecting the nesting beaches, reduce bycatch, and voila, we're going to have turtles. But it's not that simple. So there are, and it's not just, of course, bycatch too. It's, compounded by the cumulative impacts of plastic pollution and pollution more broadly. Entanglement in plastics is an issue as well, like floating ghost nets and that kind of thing. And ship strikes, vessel strikes, and then, climate change is a whole nother thing unto itself, but that's leading to shifts in range, the distribution and range of these turtles and in their prey and in fishing effort.
So are you seeing that leatherbacks are going even further north and south, or how's it affect them?
It's hard to say at this point. Our models suggest that they would be eventually shifting into habitats that were previously weren't, where they didn't occur in as high density. So we might see more, and for example, on the U.S. West Coast, turtles could push further north in numbers into British Columbia or even into Alaskan waters, where they have been sighted many times over the years, but maybe more frequently, just because you're going to see changes in the abundance and distribution of their prey, and water temperatures that are more favorable for prey. And so leatherbacks, even though they do exhibit great fidelity to nesting beaches and to areas, to foraging sites, and to migration pathways, they're, I think, quite capable of shifting their behaviors if necessary.
You mentioned your PhD. I'm aware you've been involved in conservation for, I think, 40 years now, which when we say these kinds of things, I always find it shocking. I was like,
it is a long time.
And walk us through that journey of how you got... what led you and what brought about the shift from the research to running a nonprofit? Great.
Well, a long and winding story, but I'll probably won't get into the details and all of that. But I grew up in Southern California. I always loved nature, and I loved reading and adventure, and I would read all these great adventure stories by some of the Hemingway and Kipling, and I loved, for some crazy reason, birds and primates. And so I was, would study birds and collect feathers and draw birds and read all these great books by Jane Goodall. She was a big hero of mine as a kid. And I liked Louis Leakey as well, and paleontology and primates and human history. And anyway, we had no shortage of wild animals that were in various stages of rehab as a kid. I'd like to think, anyway, that I was saving frogs and salamanders and turtles. We had a box turtle that my father worked for NASA, and this was it was used as one of the early animal models that was sent into space during biosatellites. So we had this pet turtle.
This turtle had
a little
been to
box
space?
turtle. Yeah, it had gone up into space and came down in a capsule, and it ended up in our yard as a pet because my father was working on all these early Apollo 11 stuff at NASA, and so he would take me to go visit the campus, and burrowing owls all over the campus there. So my father loved birds as well, and we'd go out birding and looking for burrowing owls, and then we'd go visit the primates that were like our animal models for humans, right?
Oh, right, okay.
You know, before we send humans up, we have to check it out and see if it's safe on animals. But I had Max anyway. Little did I know that I'd end up working with turtles, but they had this little box turtle that has just this crazy story. It was world's first turtle knot. I did learn later that the Russians were sending turtles into space too, but there were a lot of crazy questions.
I just caught on that. You said turtle knot.
Yeah, it's a turtle knot.
I love it.
I mean, I think back on that, and I wish we'd kept Max when we moved to San Diego. Max was like the best show and tell. You know, as kids, you bring in something to class to share with everyone, and I'd always bring Max. And the team at NASA was looking at how shell growth changes in 0G and things like that. I sort of followed this pathway where I was just always kind of enamored with sort of the wild kingdom and nature, and romanticized adventure and working as like a field biologist. We used to watch Wild Kingdom, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and read all these books and stories. And living in San Diego, it was a big fishing community. So I did enjoy being on the ocean, and I would go sport fishing as well and participate in that. And I met a captain who owned a commercial vessel, and he had multiple permits. He would do jigging for albacore and tuna off the waters of further out in the Pacific, off Mexico and up along the California coast. And he would do gill netting for swordfish and thresher sharks. And his 3 daughters were students at my high school and middle school, and I approached them one day and asked them if their dad would be willing to let me join him for a summer to work on the fishing boat, with not knowing fully what I was getting myself into. Yeah. And that was it's sort of an epiphany for me, because we went out there and the work was incredibly difficult, and we were setting the nets at dusk, and we had to have the nets in by dawn so that we wouldn't get sighted. All the nets had to be pulled in by dawn, and there was a boat out there in our code group of boats that it entangled with a blue whale. Oh, wow. So they lost all of their nets, and it was just a disaster. And that would happen from time to time, and then we'd bring in our catch, and the net would be filled with sharks and molas. We were targeting the thresher sharks, so we would keep those. They had the market value at the time was maybe $3 a pound or something like that, $4 a pound, and I was working for 6% of the gross. So for me, I was going to get some summer earnings and then maybe go back and try and buy my first car. But for my skipper, it was his whole livelihood. Right. He was trying to get braces for his orthodontia for his 3 daughters. And it was kind of hand to mouth, feast or famine. And so you needed to really, get, the going's good, and try and capture as much food as possible, as many fish as possible, and then get in, sell them. We'd stop at different ports along the West Coast and drop off the fish and then move on and go back out again. So we did that through the summer. And I, starting with the jig fishing and then transitioning to the gill nets later in the season. But it was the gill netting that really caught my attention, because it wasn't selective the way the jigging was. The jig boats, we were pretty much catching exclusively albacore.
The jig is a
line with a lure.
Okay.
They're set at varying lengths, and then we run them out behind the boat on a hydraulic press.
Okay.
And you engage the press when the fish start biting the jigs, and you pull them in as quickly as you can, one after another, and throw the line back out, put another one out, and the fish bounces down the chute, lands on the deck, and starts vomiting and blood and dies, and then flipping all over, and then you stack it in the hold, and you do it all over again.
Right.
Then the day is filled with hard work, and then it's cleaning the decks, and then stacking the fish, and then wheel watch. Right. Cooking the dinner, preparing everything, making sure everything's spick and span, and then you're up at 3 a.m. to make sure we don't collide with any vessels and everything's safe.
Right.
And it was nonstop. So I saw how hard he worked.
Yeah.
And for me, that was really inspirational because at the same time I was watching, and I was making, my 6% of the gross after we removed all my food costs and everything else, which was a pittance.
Right.
But the sharks would come in, and this is what really killed me.
These are thresher sharks.
We were targeting threshers, but we also caught a ton of blue sharks.
Okay.
And other sharks. But the blue sharks in particular were considered trash fish. So they would come up and they'd be thrown on the deck, and we wouldn't put them back in the water because they'd swim back into the net. And every time a shark got in the net, we had to pick it out of the net, which consumed time.
Okay.
And the longer that took, the greater the likelihood of more sharks coming. And when they would come into the nets, they were coming after the fish that were in the nets.
Right.
And then they would start to bite those fish
and devalue
them
right.
to the point where some of the fish you just couldn't sell anymore. So it was a constant. So you could see these fishermen engaged in a battle with their prey. They're just like these stupid sharks. They're coming in and ruining my catch.
Right.
And so the last thing they wanted to do was throw them back. And we'd have sharks come up, and they were pregnant, big, beautiful blue sharks that you just, terrible to see that kind of waste. And the molas as well would come up, but those we'd put back, and they'd just.
First of all, can you describe a gill net? What is that? Just like a giant funnel behind the boat?
No, it's just like these were drifting nets that had buoys, and and it's strung down to a certain depth. It just hangs below the surface.
Yeah. Okay.
And captures anything that happens to be swimming in the upper section of the water column through those areas. So the fishermen would target areas that were productive or known to harbor high densities of target species, and then they would string out their gill nets, and then they drift overnight, and they'd have beacons on them, so the boat would stay fairly close by.
Okay.
So they're not directly attached to the boat. They're independent, yeah.
Okay. And so it's just this line of net that's flowing through the surface waters and picks stuff up.
Yep.
And then you just haul it in.
It's indiscriminate. Yeah.
Right, yeah, okay.
So yeah.
Then you can catch turtles as well
as so they've been banned off the U.S. West Coast because in part for that reason, and also for marine mammals. And so, there are a lot of alternative gear types that are being developed, but the swordfish are, like, for example, the swordfish fishery has pretty much shut down off the U.S. West Coast, with the exception of very selective approaches like harpoon fishery, fishing, which requires skill.
Yeah.
You need a spotter plane to find the swordfish, and it's like a high investment for what could be a fairly low return. So the way that mechanism might work is if you have consumers that are willing to, ask where their seafood, how that fish arrived at their table. Was it sustainably caught? Mm-hmm. How was it caught? And then you need traceability, but you need willingness, and that in the U.S. market, that's a bit undermined because of the presence of foreign-caught swordfish from fleets that have act with impunity and have no rules or regulations. So, we have very well-monitored fleets in California. You can go to Trader Joe's and buy Chinese-caught swordfish for $7 a pound, and it sits alongside sustainably caught swordfish at $25 a pound.
Right. Yeah.
Most people are price sensitive.
Yeah. Sure.
So it's a very difficult battle, and it could probably be partially won through improved trade mechanisms of some sort. But in the meantime, there's been a swordfish stock that's sitting off the U.S. West Coast that hasn't been fully exploited in decades. So you have a lot of fishermen who are watching this, thinking, make this work. So there's an argument for using more selective techniques like deep set buoy gear or other things that avoid a lot of that bycatch you get at the surface, and that are more likely to, capture just swordfish, the target species.
I had no idea that nets were just left to go. That's kind of crazy. That chapter of your life, that was before getting into research in academia?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I also was interested in veterinary medicine, so I took a class at the San Diego Zoo in high school that was fantastic. It was for like 6 students that showed an interest from across the school district, and I was lucky enough to get in, and we were working with zoo vets on whatever died in the zoo that day. We would necropsy it. We would work with the specialists of all different taxa. And that was a full semester, and I did science fair, every year as a kid, and it was, I guess, a bit Well, maybe geeky. I don't know. I enjoyed doing that, and that was always fun for me. And my dad was such an inspiration in that space. We had built a centrifuge, and we're looking at the effects of increased gravitation in a homemade centrifuge on fruit flies and other things.
Wow.
That just kind of funky. So I was always interested in the science, but I also enjoyed the ocean, and this situation with the fishermen really gave me firsthand exposure, in many ways, though, to the realities of conservation. I guess that's in seeing how hard the skipper worked to support his family and how much work was involved. And he wasn't out there because he was out to get something or to injure sharks or anything. It was like, there has to be a better way and that's what conservation's about. I think it's balancing. Like you have to consider livelihoods, and if you're going to try to take away someone's income or their rights to harvest something, I need something to replace
the alternative.
You need an alternative.
Sure.
And so that's the challenge in conservation, is always reconciling kind of human needs and coming up with creative solutions to do that, where you create win-wins. And one path with turtles, and in this case, would be like, can we by creating a more selectively harvested seafood, can we ask for a higher price?
Sure.
But it's life's full of trade-offs, and this is an ongoing one. But that sort of was my first epiphany about the realities of kind of the bubble I had of the romantic kind of notion of commercial fishing just kind of vanished with that experience. Like this is really hard work. I don't think that's and I felt terrible about how many sharks we killed.
Sure.
Fortunately, most of the molas all got away. We'd let them go, and
some of those can be like 10 feet tall, can't they?
10, 12 feet, and they take time to get out of the net, and then we'd have to kind of haul them over to the side, and they're very heavy. But the thing is, I think maybe the reason molas were sort of off the hook with fishermen is they consider them really dumb, and they're like, but they're not taking $100 bites out of my my market fish.
It's interesting because a lot of fruit farmers hate parrots that are crop pests, kind of, but the thing they hate is the parrots will go along and taste a fruit and then just throw it away, and then taste another one, and they're so wasteful.
I hate that. I can see where the farmer. We have apples in our backyard.
Right.
Crows will come and peck.
If they just took one,
they just put a whole. They just took one, but they'll peck a few bites and then move on, and I'll find these ruined fruits on the ground with holes in them.
Yeah. Well, you can see how the fishermen can see that challenge with sharks. I'm curious about the arc of your career. You've got a PhD at Stanford, but you've also got an MBA, which I find very interesting because running an organization is so much more than just the science. What motivated you to get the MBA?
Yes, it was really just kind of the life for me has been sort of this circuitous path where I've just sort of gone from one experience to the next, seeking more experience and kind of building on the last one, sort of levering off of it, finding great mentors. Been fortunate enough to have some really great mentors along the way, and then kind of embracing each opportunity as a learning experience with the idea that eventually all of this knowledge would transform into something substantive. So I did a string of, I went on, did an undergraduate degree at the University of Pennsylvania. I was targeting medical school or vet school, and then but I still had this conservation desire, and I started doing a string of, through the summers, of field internships, working on shorebirds and horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay, and looking at their interaction with that bolus of eggs that are laid by horseshoe crabs, and that really critical. It's a bottleneck for these migrating shorebirds who are traveling vast distances from the south to our breeding grounds in the Arctic and rely on this influx of protein. And that was a conservation challenge in its own right, with habitat loss on the U.S. East Coast. But that was a fascinating experience, and then jumping from there to spending a summer and working in Costa Rica. We had a scientist at Penn, Dr. Dan Jansen, who's well known in dry forest ecology, and he taught a class, and one of the best classes I took at Penn was his field ecology course, and went to Costa Rica with him to Santa Rosa.
Yeah, right.
And saw all the kind of the work he was doing to restore these imperiled dry forest ecosystems in that region. And he was just such a clever researcher. I mean, he still is. I mean, but just very inspiring. So I had every summer I would make a point of doing another exciting field internship rather than just coming home and hanging out. I just wanted to go do something and learn. And then I had my first job out of college was kind of looking for internships around the Washington, D.C. area where a lot of the major international conservation organizations were based. And I had to choose ultimately between the World Bank, where I had an opportunity to be an intern working on LexisNexis and aggregating data in the Africa program, or the World Wildlife Fund. And I remember showing up at the World Bank and everyone was wearing like really nice suits and ties and walking in, and I was like, this isn't going to work for me. And it was, it's like 100 degrees outside and everyone's wearing a suit and roasting, and you just
not your habitat.
Not my habitat. So walking to WWF and they're playing soccer outside and everyone's biking in, and it just looked so much more my style. But my first day of work at WWF was the last day for several people that I was really inspired by. It was Russ Mittermeier was leaving to take over as president of Conservation International. There were a string of other long-term WWF employees who were transitioning over to CI. There'd been a change in leadership at WWF, so it was kind of a very interesting moment in time. But I had a great experience at WWF and started meeting some amazing mentors who then kind of catapulted me into one internship after another. So then I went to work with Rare through a very close friend who was connected in the forestry program at WWF, who pointed me to George Powell, or to Paul Butler.
Paul Butler, yeah.
So, that led to like running around in a parrot suit with Paul in the Bahamas, and in Abaco and in Nagua, and going to churches and proselytizing about conservation, which was great. And that was another adventure. And then working in Costa Rica with George Powell on quetzals and radio calling them and following them all over the place, up and down.
The altitudinal migrants.
Altitudinal migrants. I remember I started to grow fond of this pair that we've been watching for quite a while, and we would catch them with a big pole, kind of like what we use for turtles, but a lot smaller. Put it over the nest cavity, and they'd come out, and boom, we'd bring them down, and cover their eyes, and put a collar on them.
Right.
But I remember these two chicks fledged, and one of them kind of was a little warier than the other. And I was sitting in the brush watching this happen, and George was further up the hill, and these two brown jays came out of nowhere, just as this chick was fledging, and the chick, one of them came at the chick, and you've seen these jays. They're vicious little buggers, and the chick got hit by the jay and floundered for a moment and then dropped too fast. It wasn't quite ready to make the jump, and fell to the ground, and the jays just descended on it. And I was like, oh my God. Wow. I dropped my stuff and raced down there to George is like, stop! What are you doing?
You're gonna let nature take its course.
What are you doing? Stop! I was like, I can't see this. But he called me off, and that poor little guy was lost. But I realized,
brutal.
You have to let nature take its course in these situations, and that's data.
Yeah.
And that was a rough one, but it's the nature of it all. And then I did a string of other internships with the Nature Conservancy in California. That was another really interesting one, focusing on plants in the state of California. And I think just so many of the big NGOs. 2 or 3 others, and finally landed at the International Council I had a friend who was running the Western Hemisphere Shoreboard Reserve Network, and he introduced me to an opportunity with the International Council for Bird Preservation, which
So birds again, when you've been on birds on the East Coast, birds again, how did you make the jump from birds to turtles?
Well, I'll tell you that. I should get to because your question about this arc was, the main.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's no,
it's great.
Well, because watching all these organizations, I started to get insights into how they ran, and and some were more effective, I thought, than others. But no names. I mean, it's just the way it worked, and I noticed some back then, like. You'd have organizations that were run by business development or legal types, and they were pretty secure financially, which is always very important in an organization, and well managed. But I'd often observe schisms between the development staff and the program staff, and the program staff were often scientists or people with a technical background who were really focused on the mission and vision of the organization and on the principles of the organization and on adherence to kind of the rigor that through which in decision making about science and conservation priority setting. And there's always and I think those organizations that were run by the business development legal types did well with money, but often suffered from mission drifts, because there's always something that's just a little sexier maybe than what you're doing somewhere that can it's distracting, and it's this bright shiny object, and it brings in,
it can bring in the money,
funding.
Yeah.
And for the scientists or the people that were more who were more who adhered more rigidly to the values of the organization, they struggled to find resources because they were too locked in to that. So there was a balance that had to be kind of struck. And so what for me, kind of the thinking was, if I really want to move on in the conservation space, it would be good to be equipped with skills in business policy, but also to have that scientific grounding so that I can relate to the researchers and the program team and understand our mission and vision and speak to it directly.
Yeah.
So that for me kind of led me to think about, and I had a lot of friends at the time who had gone to Yale School of Forestry. There were a bunch of them, and Peace Corps volunteers and others in Washington, D.C. And Yale was known for also having a business degree that also had a strong public sector management component to it. So I thought, well, this is a great chance to go to the School of Forestry and combine it with the School of Management's degree. It was called an MPPM at the time. Now it's an MBA. You had that option to choose whichever one you wanted. Now it's just MBA. But Yale's reputation was around public sector management and finance, that's the other half. But so I applied there, but I'd been lucky enough to encounter another mentor who was involved with ICBP's Pan American Continental Section, and the ICBP is now BirdLife International. They went through a major overhaul and a rebranding while I was there, and that was a really serendipitous experience for me, because I was hired to kind of galvanize the network, identify the strategy for the Americas, working with a team based out of Cambridge, and then we had another program officer in Ecuador. And together we were kind of trying to rebuild the Latin American and North American continental section into a new model with partner organizations in each country. So we'd traveled all over Latin America doing incredible birding. I saw birds that the British, they were mostly Brits that do this with, and they were incredible birders. So they would go out until 3 in the morning, and then we'd get to bed, and at 4:30 there'd be a knock on my door saying, "Get up, we're leaving." What? We're going to go find the noble snipe. Get up.
Noble snipe. Brilliant. Yeah.
And like, oh my God. Driving up through, and I know when we get back from our noble snipe hunt, we're going to be in meetings for the next 8 hours, and then we're going to be up again until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., and then we're going to be up again. And that's the way it was, a vicious cycle. They were we had a guy who, one of the Africa, John Fanshawe, you may know him.
I know the name.
Yeah, John was set the record for most birds spotted in a single day. I mean, they were using helicopters and planes and cars in Africa. It was somewhere in East Africa, but I think it was north of like high threes, maybe 400 species in a day.
Wow.
It was quite an honor these guys were crack birders. I was such a neophyte, but it was a lot of fun to be in the field with them, and I really enjoyed those days. But I ultimately leveraged that opportunity to pursue graduate school, and I applied both to the joint degree and to Stanford for a master's at the time. And my advisor, who was Don Kennedy, then the former president of Stanford, and he was editor-in-chief of AAAS at the time, was super encouraging and took me in as an integrated, interdisciplinary. I did ecology and evolutionary biology, but he let me kind of put together a really creative master's.
Right.
And in this case, I was working with another student to look at effects of wind energy on birds of prey and the application of GIS to identify areas of risk for raptors.
At some point in your graduate career, you did the Great Turtle Race.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah.
About that?
So after all that, I went on to business school at Yale, and I teamed up with a group of really diverse students in an entrepreneurial management course that I took. One was an MBA was doing a joint degree with Harvard, and Harvard was Yale Law and Harvard Business School. Another was a primatologist from Duke, a very good friend to this day who'd done his work in Madagascar and was getting an MBA at Yale and was very much like a similar mindset to me. He's doing conservation finance now. And then another was an MD from Germany, and he was an MD PhD combo, and he was very sharp. And we'd created this little startup called thescience.com where we were trying to create a gaming model to get kids interested in science, leveraging kind of new technology and social media.
And this is early internet days.
This is 1998, 99.
Wow. Okay. Right.
Yeah. So, and then that, of course, like most startups do, it failed. I mean, we kind of went our separate ways for various reasons. And I landed at Discovery Communications in animalplanet.com as a director of business development. And that was fun at first. I had this, again, romantic ideas about what happened within, about science media.
Yeah.
And I had a dream about getting science out to, conservation-minded people and kind of I was interested in the Chinese alligator, some of the more, how to get content out about that to the user base at Discovery, because they had such a wide reach. But what I learned is that, what was more important from our end was kind of what Steve Irwin was going to name baby. What's he going to call his daughter? What type of baseball hat does he wear? These questions that, I don't know if he wore a baseball hat, but just questions that were more sort of social and, in my opinion, almost trivial.
Yeah.
But they were, the public wants to
human connection,
have that connection. And so, there was a lot of good content, but I felt like there was an opportunity to do more. And then I was kind of wooed by a former friend who was an oil bird expert and was working at Conservation International, where I'd also done an internship in Costa Rica years back, to come to Conservation International and get involved in working as a director of operations for their Andean. That's where I kind of got hooked on turtles, but that came after we'd built this initiative called the Eastern Tropical Pacific Seascape, which was a 4-country transboundary project linking together the governments of Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador in a joint effort to protect biodiversity across their EEZs with an emphasis on highly migratory species. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I eventually returned to Stanford to start a PhD. I decided it was time to go back to school after working at Conservation International for several years, and was lucky enough to come away with CI took me on as a research fellow, and Stanford accepted me. I found a new advisor because so much time had elapsed, and my former advisor, and I had decided I wanted to work on marine-related work. So his advice to me was, you got to go to Hopkins, of course. And Barbara Block, who's a researcher there, was doing a phenomenal project called the Tagging of Pacific Pelagics, which involved tagging 23 different species across the Pacific and kind of aggregating all of that data, asking and answering a lot of really important species-driven and taxonomically-driven questions along the way, but then integrating that data into a meta-analysis which would flag the most important hotspots for biodiversity across the region, so you get bang for your conservation buck. And this was the holy grail for me, because the whole vision of the seascape had been kind of, at the time, there wasn't really an effective mechanism for protecting highly migratory biodiversity in the open ocean, mm-hmm.
which
Which requires extensive collaboration. And the CI's Conservation International's approach was using terrestrial endemism of vascular plants as a proxy for endemism of other terrestrial species, and it didn't fit as nicely into a marine paradigm.
Right.
So we needed to develop a whole new paradigm that was more than coral reefs and seagrass beds. And that was trying to understand, that tied in a lot of other static and dynamic covariates, which is what the tagging of turtles led me to. And so to get to the Great Turtle Race, I had to get to turtles first. And so I found my way to turtles because I arrived at Stanford focused on tuna, billfish, and sharks, which are, I figured, commercially valuable species, non-commercially valuable species, but threatened from the targeting commercially valuable species, and then recreational species, the billfish, which has potentially selectively targeted and could provide income for conservation. So I was working on a triad of species, and then these two leatherback biologists found me one day. Bumped into them at a meeting here in Monterey, and they said, "Why don't you come to Costa Rica and tag turtles?"
Right.
I thought about that for a moment. I was like, the life of a sea turtle biologist, you stay up all night, putting tags on, and or wandering the beach during, counting nest, and making sure that they're placed in safe places and keeping poachers off the beach. And then by day, you enter your data, and then you just, relax a little bit, and you're on the ocean. Frank Palladino and Jim Spotilla are, world-renowned leatherback, still a sea turtle biologist in general, but they had been running a long-term monitoring program at Playa Grande, and they invited me into their world, the Leatherback Trust. And so that was my kind of the first time that my advisor, Barbara Block, was cool with it. She said, "Okay, go with Jim and Frank. They're great. They're like my brothers. You can, go. You have my blessing. You can still do the tuna and shark and billfish stuff too." And I was like, of course, I'm never one to say no. So I continued that because that was always more adventure and really great questions to ask. But I shifted my focus more to turtles, and I was the only person in our lab doing turtles because we were a tuna lab really, and billfish and shark.
Right.
So it was I sort of carved out my own space, which was exciting, and I would go down to the nesting beach and deploy these tags. And after a couple years of deployments and looking at the data, we used to animate the data in 7-day, what we call worms, so you could kind of see movement. It was a quick way of watching how they moved. And you'd see these worms of, the worms were multiple daily positions, kind of compiled together, and then you'd animate them, and you could see, oh, look. And what I noticed is that, yes, indeed, there was a corridor, which was a hypothesis that Jim and Frank and one of their students had promulgated in Nature several years before, that there was a migration corridor between Costa Rica and the Galapagos area. But the tracks were shorter. The technology wasn't quite as advanced as it was when I arrived on the scene with these tags that we got. Some were from the Sea Mammal Research Unit in St. Andrews, and then others from Wildlife Computers.
Right. Really
nice satellite tags. So all of a sudden this world opened where we could see, indeed, we were able to validate, you could see that this hypothesis was valid. They were indeed moving in a concerted way offshore. And it was fun to watch these worms go. It was like, wow, so I had another meeting. The light went off because I had read about the big bird race several years prior, and that was a British mission to ban these albatross I think it was off New Zealand, and they found a number of sponsors. They named one after Jagger's wife, I believe, Bianca, and then there were anyway, they were all kind of celebrity names.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, in the big bird race, the tags all fell off.
Yeah.
So it was a sad failure, but it was really cool. And I thought, man, there's something here. But I reached out to a friend of mine and who was associated with Conservation International. He was the chief marketing officer of Plantronics headsets, and he'd done a lot of work in the corporate space with different companies. Very, very clever, crafty Stanford MBA, really sharp and energetic and fun-loving. And we started brainstorming, and sort of collectively we settled on the Great Turtle Race as an opportunity. And we looked to different models, even a gaming model that would be like, we thought, well, we could do this on eBay, or we could do this people could make invest in this. And then we realized, no, we don't want to get involved in that because that doesn't resonate well. We'll just get sponsorships.
Yeah. And
we'll use resources from the race to cover to invest in conservation. So we created, Mark secured, his name was Mark Breyer. He's written a couple books on games. And he's a super bright guy. We started putting together a sponsorship list and a strategy, and we did a mock-up for what this race might look like. And Facebook was in its nascency.
Right.
And so there was MySpace, Facebook, and a couple others at the time. There were these new groups, and there was an opportunity to build characters around these turtles. So Mark was able to secure pro bono marketing support from McCann Erickson, a big marketing firm, which was wonderful. So we started brainstorming, and then he got the CMO for Yahoo involved as an anchor sponsor as well. And then we brought in Dreyer's Ice Cream through some of Mark's connections, and the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, and then a couple other. We cobbled together.
Any big names?
Yeah.
Any celebrities?
So then, that was the big hit. So then we caught the attention of another friend who was a tuna fisherman who came by the lab and had a nephew who loved turtles, sea turtles. And he heard about what we're doing, and he's like, I have an idea. Well, he hooked me up with his sister, right, Brooke, and their brother was working for Stephen Colbert. So through them, we got access to Colbert. We pitched the idea, or they helped us pitch the idea to Colbert and Colbert's team, and lo and behold, Stephen Colbert bit. So we had now a comic voice. Fantastic. And that we got the Colbert bump. So when we put the race together, we had 11 turtles, and we created virtual racing jerseys for each of them. We built Facebook pages and MySpace pages for all of them, and we put together a website with a whole story of the conservation actors, the community, the turtles, the work. And then I thought, we could do virtual baseball cards. So because we have stats on these turtles, we know how many eggs they laid, we know how many we know if they're rookies or first-time nesters. We know if they were injured. I just kind of went back to my field notes, and people really connected with the stories behind these turtles, which was really just narrative. I mean, they're turtles. This one was bitten by a cookie cutter shark. She's a survivor. This one clearly has had a boat strike. This one, has been hooked by a long line, and there's a hole in her flipper. And this one, she's a veteran. She's been coming here for 20 years.
It becomes relatable. That's
very relatable. Yeah. And so we created virtual baseball cards that you could sort of look at. And then we made the funniest thing was, there was one aspect of this we didn't even consider, and that we made a leaderboard. And it was supposed to, I thought it would my vision was like it updates daily, and you can have the turtles shifting. But I had the help of the assistance of some really sharp IT and technically savvy teammates, colleagues in the lab, in the block lab, who, and one of them had children. He just really got into it, and he made it so that he interpolated the data. We set all the start times of the turtles to 0. Should tell you the mechanics of the race. So it wasn't real time.
Okay.
It was near real time, but it wasn't real time. The turtles had already taken off, so I knew, where they were going, but the race, it was impossible to do it in complete real time.
Some artistic license.
We had some artistic license. Yeah. So, but this is where it got funny. So James made the leaderboard. James was one of the colleagues in the lab that was doing the kind of back end work with software and running along with another colleague, Alan. Both great guys. They loved it, and we had the leaderboard updating like every 10 minutes. So it became really sticky.
Oh wow!
So people were like, coming back to. And we got traffic from all over the world, right? And people with Colbert presenting the turtles, and we named one after him, Stephanie Colberto the turtle, right? So he was in. He opened 4 episodes of the Colbert Report with the Great Turtle Race. Stephanie was in Stephanie was in front the first 2 segments, and then she got Wendy, the West Marines turtle here, a marine company here, and the local company that's kind of now a global player, but she crept up on Stephanie and got into the lead, and Colbert accused her of cheating and laying ping pong balls. She's not, she's a fake turtle. Back then, I mean, you have to remember this was like, by the time we did the race was 2007, right? So Facebook, all these companies were just starting, and we got, 700,000 unique users is a big deal back then.
Yeah.
We just
even now, right?
Even
it's
now,
a big deal.
And they were from all over the world, and there were cruise ships in the Galapagos waving banners, "Go Stephanie," and we won. And people were writing, "I think Wendy's a real champion. She had that cookie cutter shark bite, and she's persevered." And Yeah, so
Brilliant.
it ended up, we raised over $400,000. We channeled it into the purchase of the tags and into investment in the project.
Mm-hmm.
And then the race was replicated the next year, and they did a C2C, a Caribbean to Conservation International got really invested. They became a partner in the first race and then really involved in the second. And
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't really sustain it because I was trying to finish my PhD, and it just lopped a year off my PhD because it was so distracting to.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember that the day I walked into our local coffee shop, and I saw a newspaper. I was going to order a coffee, and I looked down, and it was the Monterey Herald, and on the front page was a big leatherback, and it said, "And they're off." And it started with an interview with myself and like the local media, and I'd forgotten to. I hadn't really. It got to the point where I couldn't keep up with it, so I didn't tell Barb, my advisor, about this. I was just like, I'm having interviews right now. It's not a good look for a grad student if you got your supervisor next door. And I came into the office that day, and she's like, "Come into my office right now." I'm like, what? I do. I got the newspaper. Oh shoot, I'm in trouble. And so she told me, "George, you can't. There's a risk of this gambling happening with this."
Oh.
I was like, "That's a Barb. This is not a gambling. There's no gambling involved at all. This is done with the purest of intent. Where this is a conservation race, and you could do it with other species. You could do it with billfish. You could do it with tuna. They've done it with birds." She was suspicious. Well, I found out later, like within days, that Ladbrokes Casino had put odds out on these turtles.
Really?
So there was gambling happening in the UK, and I was like, "Oh my God, I know the answer."
Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, but I could make some money here. No, but we immediately were like alerted them. We're like, cancel this. You guys realize, we kind of put the word out that this is, don't overstep because people will bet on anything.
Yeah.
But that was a wake-up call. And then the race was replicated in a Canada Caribbean version, which involved Pearl Jam.
Oh, right.
And it was right around the timing of the Olympics, so the U.S. men's and women's swimming and I think water polo teams got involved, or at least the swimming athletes. The turtles were named, after them, and they were give commentary about the race. And then there was a race to the date line. Every race had permutations based on the behavior of the subpopulation that we were studying and a whole backstory. So in the West Pacific, the turtles engaged in a lot of kind of search behavior, lots of circles, which isn't good for a race if you're trying to go from point A to point B and you're like this.
Yeah.
But we decided we needed a new criteria, we need number of circles. And we threw in vertical behavior too, so that we could have extra, like a competition within a competition, because it was clear that some turtles just weren't going to follow the rules.
Right.
And then all of this was replicated there were a lot of spin-offs all over the world that followed from this. There's a race, a tournament of turtles that's now happened, that's been ongoing for like 20 years in the Caribbean, or however many years, 15 years. And other groups all over now have kind of run with it, which you expect.
It's a great way of driving awareness.
Which is what we need.
Well, yeah. And so you've finished your PhD, you've gone through some different conservation organizations, and then Upwell, that was sort of seeing an unmet need?
Yes.
And the oceans, we've talked already about like lots of sea turtle conservation work is nesting beaches, but that's just such a tiny fraction of their life cycle. What led you to be a co-founder of Upwell?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you raised that, because that was a really formative moment. I had a very close friend and colleague who had started to work. She introduced her to the Leatherback Trust, and she came on as our director of operations and been working. She's a background in natural resource economics and a PhD from Berkeley. And her name is Kristen Reed, and she was instrumental. She sort of challenged me when we were contemplating, what are we doing? We've been focused on this nesting beach and on these turtles, and we're doing great things from a nesting beach conservation perspective. Wonderful things, great awareness, great protection. almost 100% protection from poaching, great vigilance, great research, but are we achieving the bigger goal, which is recovery and conservation of this population, and not just this population, but turtles more broadly. And so what is it that's driving, what are the driving threats? And that just kind of led back to that, well, we've got to look, we've got to take a bigger picture approach here. The threats are at sea. They're out there 99% of of their lives, and there's so much we don't understand. What happens from 0 to 20 years of age, the lost years, right? What goes on in that period? Is that a bottleneck we're missing? Why we're seeing so many turtles come back with wounds and scars and hooks in them, and being maimed from fisheries or dying of plastic ingestion. The threats, there are a lot of threats out there that aren't being addressed, and they're really hard to address. And so, and giving that more thought, we decided, it was time to sort of spin off and start our own initiative. And we found some supporters who were willing to join us. And together, the two of us created Upwell. And we took some time thinking about a name. We went through lots of names. And Kristen had a colleague, some friends from college that had founded their own marketing company, communications type work. And we brainstormed with them, came up with hundreds of names, and winnowed it down to one, which just kind of rolled off the tongue nicely and was so much about kind of what drives, as I mentioned, the occurrence of these turtles. Once we got the name, then we worked on the logo, and we found a great logo designer, and we wanted a stylized leatherback, and this is what we came up with. And so branding is a big part of this, and so here we are back to business. The business school. I
actually was thinking, I love it because. You're saying, you had the marketing friends, and all throughout this conversation, you've been pulling in these different players, these different characters, that different roles, and that's what conservation is. The people I talk to, I find that they're all sort of conductors of an orchestra that bring in all the different instruments at the appropriate moments.
Yes, that's
exactly what you've done, and but you speak about it so eloquently. It's great. It's really, really good, and it is the branding. We run non-profits, but that's just tax code. We're running businesses.
Yes.
It's just there's a tax code that's different. But all those same things apply. We need good branding. We need awareness of what we do in order to help the animals.
That's right. Yeah, you have to, and you need, Kristen is now the operations director of Upwell, and she's, I think she would agree that learned so much through this process as well. I mean, there's so much that and she's like sort of stumbled into, I think, the business side of the organization, which is super important, because her background was more on the research side and on, in sociological and economic research, which was very complementary anyway to the natural history-based work that I've focused on in my thesis. And we kind of come together in conservation as an overarching umbrella, and it is so interdisciplinary. It requires myriad skill sets, and keeping an organization viable, meeting all the tax codes and rules, or a nonprofit, and I think, ensuring transparency. That's a really important thing. So that people that are investing you know that their money's been being spent wisely, that they can trust you, that you'll do what you'll say, you do what you say you're going to do, and you deliver. And so we've built, I think, a really, through Kristen's vigilance, because I find myself working on so many things at once, it's nice to have someone who's very complimentary in what we do. We've secured like a Charity Navigator Platinum transparency status, and
congratulations, that's awesome.
Really try to play by the rules, and started developing impact reports every year, and just one thing after another. We're growing. We're now at 6.
There's so much involved. Sorry, you were going to say?
I was right. 6 full-time staff, and then we have a suite of contractual scientists, researchers, and observers that work with us, and then outside consultants from time to time on a project-specific basis. Yeah.
Let's get back to the turtles, because we just touched on the lost years, and that is very interesting part where I'm thinking of the timeline of the turtles, turtle nesting beaches. That there's lots of work there, but there's this big gap in our knowledge from when they leave the nest, leave the nesting beaches, to, in the case of the females, when they return. So what's going on in that window of time, and how are you as an organization? What is it you're doing with these lost years? How are you advancing conservation there?
So that's one of the things I love about this work. There are still so many mysteries that remain. With sea turtles are only 7 species, but at first blush that seems like nothing when you think about the world of birds, right? Over 9,000, but there's 7 really unique species, and they've radiated into these niches, and then they've diverged into subpopulations, and they're circumglobal. So you can imagine that all of these different subpopulations are all kind of genetically unique and interesting in their own ways, and there are differences, even though they're still the same species. So, but aside from the nuance and all of the kind of interesting questions around the turtle's biology, understanding what happens between the time most people encounter turtles either when they're snorkeling, like off, say a place like Hawaii, and they see a green turtle or a hawksbill swim by, or at a nesting beach where a female comes up, lays her eggs, it leaves the beach, and then a couple months later, a bunch of little hatchlings emerge, neonates, and scrabble down to the sea, and then they disappear. Where many of them are eaten along the way, but eventually, 15, 20 years later, an adult returns or is caught somewhere in a long line or in a gill net, and people are like, well, there they are. But that phase in between is a mystery that's kind of really intrigued scientists forever. And so early pioneering work in the 1960s by scientists like Archie Carr, who's really a well-known, now deceased, but sea turtle biologist, about testing movements of turtles using balloons and watching them, with a balloon towed behind them, watching the turtle go, and like really short-term strategies. But you work, do what you can to sort of start to unravel that mystery. Yeah. Today we have all these tools at our disposal.
So the tech
is out of control, so we can put little tiny tags. I did my thesis working with the big tags on the big turtles, but I've never lost that fascination of applying technology for monitoring, and that was something going back to like when I started my PhD, was using GIS and remote sensing and to understand habitats of birds of prey. Now it's using like microsatellite tags and satellite telemetry and acoustic telemetry to understand the movements and behaviors.
Acoustic telemetry?
Yeah, we use acoustic tags. So these tags that emit a coded signal that's picked up with a receiver.
Okay.
And it can be either a hydrophone, like that you carry on a boat and follow an animal actively, or it could be done passively with receivers situated along the coast in areas where you think this animal, where you have your research questions about overlap or behavior, and where you know this animal's likely to occur.
Because sound travels so far in marine environments.
1,000 meters. You can their acoustic work gives you really specific data about presence and kind of site-based movement, but it doesn't provide the long-term data, of course, because once they move away from the receiver, they're But you get this. We double tag turtles now with both the large adults who can carry them with both an acoustic and a sat tag, and then they shed the sat tag, or the sat tag fails usually first, but they might get picked up on an acoustic array much later. And we saw that happen with a leatherback we tagged on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica, that at Pacuay Reserve, that the turtle went out into the Colombian Gyre. And about 50 days later, the tag failed, the sat tag. So we assumed that the turtle either died, the sat tag fell off. We don't know. And then, like 5 or 6 months later, we got a message from the Canadians in eastern Canada, and that a turtle in there had been picked up in an array off of in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, near up near Rimouski, way up in the Gulf.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really crazy.
Wow. Yeah.
So that was, that just kind of helped demonstrate the utility of multiple approaches. And we've been working with a team out of Florida at the Loggerhead Marine Life Center and Florida Atlantic University to deploy acoustic tags and test this approach on leatherbacks as they migrate up the Gulf Stream and up the eastern seaboard, where there are extensive receiver networks, and we're getting great results from that. And we're doing it with turtles in the Pacific, but the receiver networks are a little more scattered and the turtles are less shelf-based, but they do come in for several months, and we can get. You can imagine, like working with fishermen, we could get the fishers to deploy receivers with their gear, using their gear as opportunistic mooring points.
Yeah.
And then the question we have is, how can we prevent turtles from being entangled? So if we can kind of get a closer, better understand the overlap of sea turtles with fishers and with gear, and that will help us to, I think, develop strategies that are better informed.
In Malaysia, Louisa, who I spoke with, they're deploying, I think they call them bananas, and it's a yellow device. I think it's banana because it's yellow, that emits signals to discourage marine mammals from coming near nets. But going back,
so for the lost years,
the lost years. Going back to that, is that specifically leatherbacks or
all turtles?
All turtles.
Yeah,
and you're collecting movement data with this technology, and are you sort of building up a better understanding of where they're going?
Yes. So we're using at the moment the big challenge has been miniaturizing tags for a number of reasons, because they're battery constraints. There's fragility. These little tags have shorter lifetimes typically than the larger tags you'd put on adults. But heretofore, it's been impossible to get information about these little turtles. So we're happy to get every little bit of data we can. And we've spent, with the team, we had a student that I was on her committee, and one of her thesis chapters was focused on tracking leatherbacks out of Pequare using towed acoustic tags. We had a little tag on a float, attached the turtle with a little bit of, there's a little Velcro. We used a vet bound, which is like a veterinary glue, attached the Velcro to the turtle's back, and then had a little hook there on the Velcro patch from which a line trailed, and then there was a fishing bobber, and then the tag would dangle behind that, and we'd go out and follow the turtle with a hydrophone. And she did this for weeks in the blazing sun or in the pouring rain. It was one or the other. There was no canopy on the boat, and the little hatchling doesn't move very fast. A little neonate moves very slowly, so you're just like put for 3 hours. And then we were releasing drifters as well, because we wanted to understand, are these turtles moving actively or passively? Are they just drifting, or are they, are they thinking? Are they on a trajectory?
Yeah.
And sometimes we'd lose those drifters in the surf and have to chase them down. But the drifters gave us kind of where the currents would take you.
Okay.
And the turtles gave us where the turtle wants to go. And usually it was largely influenced by currents, but there was directionality, and there was the indication or determination of active movements.
Right.
And then we had a subsequent student who carried that work, who continued the work, and was able to flag kind of a threshold in current speed. So if the turtles were swimming against the current and the current reached a certain speed, velocity, the turtle would pretty much stop expending energy. Why bother?
Just cruise.
And then resume when the time was right. But they all kind of followed a similar orientation, but they at different, depending on the strength of the prevailing current, countercurrent.
Yeah, there's something that makes me think of, there was a Wimbrel that was tracked trying to fly south from the Arctic or something, I can't remember, but it was like it was in a headwind of a storm doing something like 9 miles an hour for 9 hours or so. I can't remember the exact. But then it got kind of to the other side of the storm. It was doing like 100 miles an hour relative to land speed. And they're just like, whee!
Just got ripping along. Yeah. I can imagine that these turtles will get rapidly pulled in those storms.
Do you think that they intentionally, does their survival, do they survive, have greater survival probability if they get into these currents? Because is that an adaptive to take advantage of the current?
It could be. We're seeing off South Africa that we've been working with the Two Oceans Aquarium Foundation releasing turtles, and we've noticed that if we release them, like say in Cape Town, off of Cape Town, in that area you've got an area where a very cold current that's moving north, and it's sluggish, versus the other side of Africa, Sodwana Bay, and where you have a much warmer southern flowing current that's kind of like the equivalent Gulf Stream equivalent, but flowing south, and animals get into that current and they just get shunted down, but they have time to acclimate, on a belt all the way down to to the tip of Africa.
Right.
And then they end up circling around in eddies, and they run into the retroflexion zone where the two currents converge, the Benguelas and the Angolas current come together. And then the turtles will be dispatched into these rings. Well, they'll go in circles for a well, or some might swing off and head to the west. And some even go around the Cape and up towards Namibia. But if you do the releases on the west coast of Africa and right into the cold current, it's probably a bit of a shocker for the turtles who've been sitting in rehab for a while, because these are all, would be cold stunned turtles that have been rescued.
Yeah.
And then they're like, whoa, and they go into what is very productive, an amazing productive cold environment, but it's amazing for a lot of reasons, and it brings in a lot of predators too.
Okay,
and if you're kind of like, the current's not there to whisk you away, and there's lots of big things out there, it can be a bit of a challenging situation. So on the other side, even if and we know there's lots of big predators and those big sardine runs that happen off the east coast of South Africa, the current's moving pretty fast, so you can kind of make hay and get out of there,
right,
and just go with it. And there's plenty to eat, and by the time you get around into the colder water, you've kind of figured it out. I think you've had a chance to get acclimatized. So the Lost Years program has really morphed. It started with basic questions about using acoustic tags, which at the time we didn't have these miniature sat tags, but it's really developed because we've built a strong relationship with one of the tag manufacturers. And this was something that years ago several colleagues and I got together and we hosted a workshop at a biologging symposium that focused on tag miniaturization. And it's, you have in the tagging world, it's kind of dominated by a small suite of companies.
Yes.
And it's like building a satellite tag is like building a new pharmaceutical product. There's a tremendous capital that goes into it up front. You have to cover software design, engineering, people's salaries, coding. But once the tag is built, the components are, probably the tag in and of itself is probably, not worth the price. I mean, not even probably. But you're paying for all
the R&D,
the investment in R&D, and that makes sense to me. But it's hard when the demand is. We'd like to think, sea turtle biologists, these tags where there's plenty of people using them, but the reality is, I've been asked the question too by the tag manufacturers. So how many? What's the market for this? How many of these tags do you think we can sell in a year? And I'm like, well, maybe it's not that big. We might buy 100, but how many other, if we get very myopic. And then there's this expectation in the biology community that these tags should be cheap. Why? The components are only $50. You could get these somewhere else. Where? Show me where you can get them. But there are competitors that have entered, and there's open source software and coding, and there are groups out there that are which is great because it fosters competition, drives the prices down, but that are engaged in trying to create their own bespoke tags. But I think we've been very fortunate because we've developed strong relationships with a couple different tag manufacturers for different projects. And with the Lost Years, we've worked most closely with a company called Low Tech, and they've been very willing to experiment with us, to take our input, to help design, because these things just didn't exist. 2-gram tags we're using now with solar cells, with depth sensors and pressure sensors, and
so you are also tracking depth with the micro tags.
With these tiny miniature satellite tags. And we have at this moment there are 2 models. There's a 2.4-gram one and a 12-gram one. So the idea was to develop a suite of stage-based tags. So we could have tags that kind of grew with the turtles. We could switch from.
Are you able to then catch a turtle and if it's got the stage 1, and then go in and catch it and then upgrade its tag?
That would be really, really difficult because they still just kind of go out into the great blue yonder.
Right.
Most of the species, even like across the board, these are the first two years of for most of these turtles is pelagic.
So a tiny little leatherback turtle is leaving the beach and going straight out into the ocean. And what are they eating?
So they're opportunistic. They're eating whatever they can get their mouth around, and that's why they're very vulnerable to plastics.
Right.
And a lot of them die of plastic ingestion. But and this is so That question touches on ontogeny, right? Like when do you see shifts in turtles' development based on age? And so, and that's a big fundamental question, for the lost years work, is like trying to pinpoint when these ontogenetic shifts occur and what drives them.
Right.
And so, when do they go through dietary shifts, and how is that? What's the signal in their behavior and in their environment that suggests that they're transitioning? We noticed. We work closely with a team in Thailand that's been able to rear leatherbacks to up to 2 years, and they do it very, very well. And we're working to document the growth of these turtles with a series of measurements in captivity. So they picked up a signal that there's a shift occurring around 6 months, for example, in leatherbacks. And the leatherbacks are heretofore essentially impossible to see one. Very few people on the planet have seen a 3-month-old leatherback, 6-month-old leatherback. The only way to do that is to rear them in captivity.
Right.
And there's tremendous learning that can come from that process about ecophysiology and conservation physiology and turtle biology in general. So we've been able to pick up, and notice something really unique. And this has carried over. We have a partnership with the Digital Life 3D lab in at University of Massachusetts Amherst, where we work with a whole team led by a fellow named Duncan Urshick and his students to create animated 3D models and he's got, if you visit the website, they have the 3D Life, the Digital Life Project. They have renderings in 3D of many different animals. Sea turtles are just one of them, but we're trying to build an animated model of leatherback development from the neonate, newborn, all the way to the mature adult. And so it's really trippy to watch when you see these little leatherbacks. They're tiny little things, and they've got little scales, and they bear a resemblance for sure to the adults, but they go through so much change. They go from being a thing that that's 30 grams to an animal that's almost 2,000 pounds.
Yeah.
And they grow really quickly. So you ask about their diet, and it changes. Eventually, there is a tipping point where they start to, at one point they're eating whatever they can get their mouth around, then suddenly they start to become more selective, and then they specialize.
Right. Okay.
And that when and where they specialize is important to know. Because those are probably important areas too.
Yeah, well, I was going to I'm wondering, so you said the key thing there, you said when and where, which in biology terms we'd say the spatial and temporal distribution.
Yes.
But that, is that what you're getting from this data that then, can you then apply that to conservation?
Yes.
Is that the goal?
So we're building species distribution models and habitat suitability models based on the data that we're pulling in from these tags. So we can take the positions we get from the tags, and then we can use remotely sensed satellite data and ocean modeled data,
right,
to kind of understand what are the kind of critical environmental covariates associated with the turtles in this temporal spatial context.
Wow, okay.
Then look at their behavior while they're in those areas. How are they diving? How, what are they doing? Are these foraging dives? Are these searching behaviors? And then we can take it a step further and say, well, what else is going on in that area where these turtles are doing these things? What are their threats?
Right.
And new technologies like Global Fishing Watch have enabled us to pull in vessel data, which we can then use to either assess the risk for ship strikes or assess the risk for interaction. And by looking at our predictive models, so much of the work we do is based on modeling, because you can only tag so many turtles. But the turtles are really good for validating the models and for providing real-time data. There's no getting around real-time data, but at the end of the day, the ocean's changing. You have limited resources, and so you want to do the best you can to acquire as much data, and I think in a holistic way across the life history, if you can, of the species and even the population, if you can get to that level, so you understand where are the nursery habitats, where are the habitats where these turtles grow and develop, where are they going to breed, where are the hot spots for foraging. And you can develop a dynamic management strategy that takes into consideration the shifting movements of these animals in real time.
Right. So then, are you having success when you've got this you're building up this map of where they're going and when and what they're doing there, and that's 3D, and that they're okay. This month they're in this area and they're doing deep dives, but over when they're here they're not doing deep dives. This is mind blowing.
Yeah.
The complexity of this.
It's a lot of nowadays AI is helping out with
Well,
this.
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's great. But then are you able to then your work with fishers? Is that where you're able to then kind of move the needle for turtles?
So it's good you touched on that. I think that's the most complicated part of the job is the human dimension.
Sure.
It always is in so many ways, but. So the tagging and the field research is really fun, and it's like it's a pursuit. And
the biology is easy, relatively speaking. I mean, for us, animal people.
Yeah, it is. It's exciting. It's engaging. It's it's thought provoking, and don't get me wrong, working with people is awesome. We couldn't get the work done without it, but it brings in a whole suite of challenges that are in many ways very unpredictable. People are anything if predictable, or but predictable, but. And that a lot of that, like working with that's where it all has to go. So all this information that's the whole reason we developed Upwell is to figure out a way to get at this information empirically, so we would have quantitative, robust models to work with, and then to get that information in the hands of policymakers and decision makers. And so that last step, you find that there are good actors and bad actors, and actors who haven't yet figured out what they want to be. And in a political context, like. Governments are always turning over and changing, and you can be on a great trajectory for 4 years, and then boom, you're in a real mess, and it's unknown whether or not you get out of it. And that's over and over again. You see this. There are a lot of governments that oversee, that because of the nature of their movements and their kind of broad distribution, sea turtles are vulnerable everywhere, and And so trying to get governments, we try to leverage conventions like the Inter-American Sea Turtle Convention or regional fisheries management organizations, but they, like IATTC, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, or the RFMOs, the regional fishery management organizations in the Central and North Pacific, or ICAT in Europe. I mean, they're all over the world. The oceans are governed by these multilateral bodies, right, with different governments.
Well, that has to be because the turtles don't care.
The turtles don't care, but the problem is, you have to count on people to act in the best interest of humanity and of wildlife, and that's often not the way it works. So, there'll be 95 people that are representatives of different governments that agree on something, and then there'll be 5 that don't, and that's enough to politics comes into play, and then it's you take that from me, you're going to get this then in return.
Sure.
And so. Like, can't we all get along and save these turtles? They're just turtles, but there's so much more behind it.
Yeah.
You talk about trade sanctions or something, and that, there's always a cost. I think, decision makers are constantly weighing those and saying is what means more, loss of leatherbacks and an ecological role, or no more access to chips.
Yeah, well, I think. What I know of your work, you've done great stuff of building bridges there, and instead of it being hitting conservation against fishers' livelihoods, you've managed to build some bridges, and that is for the benefit of the turtles. I think that has been a big success of your work, where you managed to engage those communities.
Here's another way we come at it. Now that you mention it, because I have this book in front of me. I wrote with a co-author, Helen Bailey, this children's book many years ago, which was right when I started having, when we started building a family. That's my daughter up there, and she. This was kind of dedicated to I dedicated it to Helen and I, to our kids, and it's called the Grande Turtle Adventure, but it's based on satellite tracking data from Playa Grande, where we took the whole data set, and then we're like, well, the people were really, we want, for Eastern Pacific leatherbacks, there are fishing communities all over South America and Central America on the coast. Yeah. And these fishermen, they all have kids, and it's like the cigarette, getting the tobacco the best way to get parents to change their behavior is maybe through their kids, hounding them and saying, "Why are you doing that? Recycle, mom. Stop smoking. Whatever."
Yeah.
So we figured if we could share something, with communities and with stakeholders in the region, one nice tactic could be to have a book that documents the story in Spanish and English, and then get the book out into these communities and share it with children. And it's just kind of grassroots education, but education outreach, as I'm learning, by doing with our team, is just such an important part of what we do as well, and of conservation.
It's an interesting challenge, isn't it, though, because it's so indirect. It's almost like it sort of seems like PR in a way, where the kids are not the ones that are impacting the turtles, but it's a strategic move to getting where you want to get, and also investing in the future. But I love that there's the book, and we've got one on the parrots as well, and it's a useful tool. But it's interesting that the organization's work it spans a whole range of areas where you're doing research, there's outreach, and there's policy. What are the bits I'm missing? Are there key parts of what you do?
I think those are the three those are three pillars for sure.
Right.
Research, education, awareness, policy. I think that's the essence of those are kind of
it's a classic.
I mean, I'm trying to think, is there anything different than I think we're grounded in some pretty solid principles around doing this work, empathy, and transparency, and maybe perseverance, because conservation, as is like one step forward, two steps back, and it's a constant. You have to really have a tolerance for getting beaten over the head. It's very challenging but there are victories.
You've scaled, which is something I wanted to come to, where we've talked about New Zealand and Australia, and I think there was something like also the work of Upwell is now reaching beyond California into Oregon and then Washington. What's helped you get that scale, and how have you done that?
So it's getting the word out. It's finding committed supporters. We've been able to kind of take our message to organizations and individuals who believe in us, and we've gotten. I think what's great is it's affirmation is government agencies as well to support our efforts in California through the Ocean Protection Council, through the Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management off the U.S. West Coast. We have a really strong partnership with NOAA. We work with government agencies in Australia and New Zealand. Recently, we basically ported the leatherback survey work that we do here, and we train the Kiwi, the New Zealand team, in tag deployment and vessel-based captures, and hope to do more of that. And we're supported by the government of New South Wales to do population viability analysis of leatherbacks off their coast, and also to do this species distribution model, which also comes with a risk management tool that we developed, and that's a paper that's going to be under review soon. But so we kind of ported the original Turtle Watch was developed by NOAA and was applied off the U.S. West Coast, and was specifically kind of targeting the Hawaii longline fleet and trying to reduce interactions. And that's a very well managed fleet, so there's really good observer data, and fishermen have an opportunity. There's real good access to there's teeth, a little bit of teeth behind the tool. So I mean, fishermen are more willing to adopt, or at least explore ways that they could mitigate against bycatch. But in other regions around the world, these tools haven't existed. So we've developed one basically for the Eastern Pacific population we call South Pacific Turtle Watch. And the idea there is a species distribution model informed by fisheries observation data plus the tracking data, and then of course remotely sensed environmental data. But before we did that, there weren't too many tools that were kind of integrating. It's called an integrated joint species distribution model. These these multiple kind of unique data sets, because we need every bit of data we can about the presence of turtles that's valid. Because that's the only way we can build these things is more data, and a lot of these areas lack observer coverage. So we're gleaning however we can get it.
Yeah.
And then we built this tool, and we've been working to kind of figure out a way we can get different governments to adopt it. And I think part of that means training, training people, government agencies, staff, and how to kind of continue to build this model, how to update the model, how to use the model in every situation you're targeting. Who's going to use it? What is it that resonates with stakeholders? If it's artisanal fishermen, it might be different from commercial fishermen working in a totally different environment who get their information differently. How do we get this content into the hands of the people that are having the impact and encourage them to use it? So I think with things like these tools have to almost be like a franchise strategy where you take a company and you look at what you let it adapt to the region where it's
right.
Where
model
you
principles,
want it used. Yes.
and then replicate
it,
yeah.
and then it we want it to look like this. Go for it. We want it to it's going to be used by these people. In fact, no one's using a cell phone. An app's not going to work. You need to have the the information transmitted by radio.
Right.
Who knows? Or maybe at a town meeting once a week to the fishers, or it depends on. It's all relative to the audience. So every country has, its own nuance.
Yeah.
And so, our idea was to develop, and right now we're working on a broader integrated full basin model with the East Pacific turtles and the West Pacific turtles in partnership with UC Santa Cruz and NOAA to build something that's even bigger and hopefully that we can, and transferable with a tool that could come with it that could be given to governments around the world to use to better understand the impacts that they might have and weigh the risk. If we target this fish at this time, this species at this time of year, what's the likelihood of interacting with leatherbacks or other sea turtle species in this area?
Yeah.
And that goes back to then we understand the vertical behavior, and we published a paper in Conservation Bio, another student I advised named Nicole Barbour. It's a great paper about specifically, she used AI techniques, cluster analysis, and then a dive classification analysis to look at behaviors of leatherbacks that we then, were able to predict that leatherbacks are likely to be in this area at this intensity, and if they are there, these are the types of behaviors you might expect for them to be doing.
Yeah.
And what then the next step is, so what fisheries are operating in that area, and what gear types are going to put turtles at greatest risk. And if you can kind of identify who the players are and what gears they're using are most risky for turtles who are behaving typically this way in this environment at this time, then maybe they can work around that. They can continue to fish a certain way but not another. It's always just kind of figuring out the trade-offs and providing the information that could help them make decisions.
When we first met, it was in Costa Rica, and we were looking at reintroduction or translocation. And I remember that you were doing you and the team of folk that were there were looking at some really innovative stuff with leatherbacks. How can you tell us a little bit more about that project and update me on? I'm really curious to know how things have developed since we were there 2017, maybe something like that. Yeah.
So it's been that is an initiative that's taken a lot of fortitude and perseverance and just kind of hanging in there, because I think it's one of the most controversial topics in the sea turtle community that I've ever had to deal with. And it's just because there are a lot of people with very solidified opinions on rewilding and reintroduction of turtles, and I don't fully understand it because it's a strategy that's been used again and again in the terrestrial environment, and even now it's being done in the marine environment with sharks. But there is just so much uncertainty and doubt swirling around the efficacy of potential ex situ or manipulations,
hands-on
management with sea turtles, and I'm not sure what drives that. I think a lot of it's rooted in age-old assumptions that were created during a period when the technology just wasn't there. And if you can imagine, when some of the early head starting or rewilding initiatives started, one of them being the Cayman Turtle Center, then called the Cayman Turtle Farm. It evolved in part to address local needs for a turtle resource. People were consuming turtle and in the hopes that it would achieve some sort of sustainability, and then turned into a more focused effort on recovery, awareness, and conservation. And for years, there was question as to whether or not the program was contributing to the recovery of the green turtle population that was nesting in the Caymans, and they found most recently that over 90% of the turtles that are breeding in the Cayman Islands now are related to a mixed brood stock that came from all over Northern and South America and the Caribbean region and even the United States. So these turtles were brought to the Caymans and Cayman Islands, and they over time the Cayman Islands, the Cayman Turtle Center started releasing a proportion of these turtles, and they found that they now have a fairly stable and growing green turtle nesting population. So the naysayers will argue that, well, green turtles, our population and health is improving across the board. That there's some truth in that, but I think we can look at the genetics of this population. You can see that there's relatedness. That points us to the kind of, I think, success. And that has emerged as a good example of where head starting has worked. Mm-hmm. And then if you think back to when this was occurring, there was no knowledge about temperature-dependent sex determination in turtles. So when the Kemp's Ridleys were being head started off the U.S., off the Gulf Coast in the United States, big recovery effort to save this very endangered, what you might call restricted range marine turtle that exhibits a lot of residency in U.S. waters along the Gulf region and up the eastern parts of the eastern seaboard. But these turtles were critically endangered. And they're also in Mexico as well, along the Mexican Gulf Coast. And a huge effort went into trying to recover them and rearing turtles. But there wasn't this knowledge that above a certain temperature, turtles skew very female. Right. Okay. So the proportion of turtles in the nest, they were potentially releasing a lot of turtles that of a single gender. And that can lead to a lot of other complications genetically, and it's hard to get results.
But I think it's interesting that there's no forgiveness there, that we're working it out and we're learning. Like there's some early parrot reintroduction work that was done, and it caused immense challenge to continue to experiment and learn about reintroduction and the vast amount of benefit that it can bring. And so it's very interesting that there's so many parallels in different environments, but it's the same old thing.
It's the same old thing, and I think the problem with turtles that makes it really hard is that they go out to sea during this lost years phase, and you don't see them again for 20 years. And in the absence of DNA fingerprinting, which we have now, so a turtle could be disappear from the beach, but then in a year or 2 years, or maybe even sooner, a fisherman catches it somewhere. We get a DNA sample, and we can trace it back to that source population. We need quick monitoring, and that was really hard with sea turtles to get. So the team that was doing these reintroductions had to confront the reality that they didn't have hard data or evidence to show that this was successful, and it took so long to get it. Now that data is coming in as these turtles have aged and cohorts are returning, but it's taken a long time, and they didn't have satellite tracking technologies like akin to what we have today. So they couldn't measure, they couldn't see survivorship. They couldn't measure the success of their work in a real short time frame and see, these little turtles we've released are actually surviving. Right. They didn't just go out there and die, and their behaviors are similar to what we'd expect to see in this turtles in this population. We can make inferences about turtle movement based on learned migration. When you tracks of adult turtles, you're kind of looking at a reflection of what they experienced as babies. At least that's the theory, and we can sort of see the parallels when we look at the tracks of these younger turtles and the evidence that exists from adult tracking.
So this project specifically was head starting is collecting eggs and raising turtles up to a certain age and then releasing them at that age. Is that right?
That's right. The theory is that you're giving them a head start over all of the sort of to beat the predation that's based largely on size. that turtles can encounter during these really early stages. So their strategies grow fast for the turtles, get bigger than the next biggest jog ape, and you start to see these changes in morphology where they get kind of wider and rounder, at least with the hard-shelled turtles. And even the leatherbacks have the little growth jump that I was mentioning at about 6 to 7 months, and that in part is a way to get bigger than the next biggest mouth.
Right.
And so if you can boost their survivorship by a certain percentage, just by holding them a little longer, and it becomes sort of a jump start, and then releasing them, that's really potentially could help augment the population. But what's really important, and this is fundamental to the head starting, is that you continue to protect the nesting beaches so the turtles have a place to return to, and you mitigate the threats. But in the case of Eastern Pacific leatherbacks, and reduce those threats. In the case of Eastern Pacific leatherbacks, it's a race against time, because the threats are so pernicious and so sweeping that it's, at least from what I've seen and what's obvious, but looking at the number of where these turtles go and the amount of fishing pressure they encounter, is it's going to be really hard to achieve the reductions that our population viability analyses say are required to move the needle. So just even to ensure persistence is very difficult. It's not going to happen unless we can get a 40% reduction in bycatch, for example, in the Eastern Pacific in 20 years. And then what's really interesting is that those percentages of bycatch reduction are really amorphous. Like, what does that really mean? Bycatch where? Bycatch when? What type of bycatch? And so trying to pinpoint exactly how to do these reductions, we just don't have time. There's not enough time left.
Yeah, so it's interesting when I hear resistance to hands-on management. The alternative is very clear. For me, it's like the trends are clear. If we don't take action, these populations, whether it's parrots or or turtles or any other species,
condors,
they're gonna be gone. It baffles me that people are not more open to hands-on management. And I've seen something with the turtles where the population was going to be functionally extinct by 2080, I think it was, or something like that. It's like, well, why wouldn't we try?
Right, you've nothing to lose because you're going to lose them.
That's what I was searching for.
Well, that's kind of where that's where I come from. That's my rationale in this is, even like the concept of translocation just makes the sea turtle community, it makes their heads spin. It's a hard one to process. Moving them from one basin to another, and you're like, well, I mean, these basins, it wasn't that long ago. And
this is the Caribbean to the Pacific.
It wasn't that long ago that the Panama Canal was underwater. Right, 3 million years ago. This is an animal with a really shallow lineage. It's panmitic. It's not, at the end of the day, you can be a purist and argue for saving, the differentiation that exists within the genes of this subpopulation or management unit. But what is it going to get you? Well, what it might get you is the loss potentially of this population on the other side. And what does that mean for leatherbacks globally? Well, it means that the Pacific has lost an ecosystem function, an animal that goes out there, and it's not just the purity of the genes that we should be worrying about. We should be worrying about losing an ecosystem role. The jellyfish are out there mopping up a third of their body weight a day, or the leatherbacks, and jellyfish.
Right. I see.
Those are the same jellyfish too that are consuming the larvae of commercially viable important species.
Right. So there's this trophic cascade.
It's a whole cascade. So at the end of the day, you kind of have to come to grips with the reality of, look, this is a mess we've made. Humans have done this. We've done it to ourselves, and humans have to fix it. So. Fixing it will come with a cost, but I mean, we shouldn't get into the weeds if we're not about the nuance of translocation in this context, because you also have a population that's probably genetically very truncated. There's massive inbreeding depression, and when you reach this size, it's very difficult to even find a mate.
Right.
And so, maybe you add hybrid vigor then.
There's this issue of shifting baselines, and I remember hearing that Columbus's men on the ship complained that they couldn't sleep because there's so many turtles hitting the boat. Turtles have faced so much dramatic loss. I really admire the work that you're doing how do you stay hopeful?
Yeah, I think you have to just try and maintain a sense of optimism, and then find the right. There are a lot of people in the world who'll bring you down, but you kind of keep a careful eye on, keep the ones who bring you up the closest, because they'll who believe in what you're doing and who are inspired and inspire you, as you know, in the field. And look for examples outside of outside of the community, with
Right.
other species, other taxa and champions who've persevered and succeeded. I think that, and think about the greater goal. And I think incrementally, like we went from that workshop in 2017 to having, unfortunately, COVID hit us, and then we had a big workshop online, which was very, very challenging, over like 5 meetings with a really diverse group of like 70 different researchers with strong opinions.
Wow.
And lots of coalitions and collusion being formed. And it was amazing how, my head was spinning at the end of it, how challenging that was. It was exhausting, but we reached a consensus that more research needed to be done, which then enabled us to kind of, address, because so much of the arguments against head starting have been a lot of hand waving, and people just hanging on to preconceived notions and ideologies without, willingness to embark, at least experiment and test assumptions and test hypotheses. And so we got a consensus statement that to do the research, which at first blush sounds like, well, that seems like an easy out. But the good news is that then we moved on and had a research workshop to talk about what the research priorities were, and kind of systematically go through them and raise those questions. And that's where we are now. So we've had 2 workshops to follow from that, and we're moving towards trying to actually challenge some of these assumptions and try and get at what are the real implications of doing this. And I think one other important thing to point out was, I noticed within the community that there's some misconceptions, what I would call misconceptions, or there are certainly preconceptions about head starting and ex situ management measures. Even though we've been doing ex situ for decades with sea turtles, we relocate nest, we water nest and shade nest. I mean, there is human intervention, but it's just the concept of captive rearing and release that really sets this apart. And I think there's a fear in the community. Like a lot of the nesting beach monitoring teams have been doing the same dedicated work, and these are really committed people. Like what they're doing is amazing, against all odds, protecting these beaches. But there's a certain comfort in doing this, not being challenged to have to do new things, but to carry on with what you've been doing and what works. And if you've been told for decades that this is bad, then there's why go there?
Yeah.
If that was the ideology, then why test it? Don't rock the boat, and a lot of these groups are recipients of funding that may not allow for that type of flexibility. So there's a fear that, I think, too, from these groups, that if they try a different route or test a different pathway, they may risk losing resources from committed funders. And then there's also this fear that if money is invested in head starting or ex situ measures that are different, but in truth are complementary, right, to in situ measures, because never would you want to forego those. You have to do it all together. That will take money away from conservation on the ground, their conservation, the model that they're accustomed to. And I think nothing could be more wrong, because I think at the end of the day, it's you build a bigger pie. You don't to think that there's just a discrete amount of resources out there for conservation, I think is wrongheaded. You have to be creative, grow a bigger pie, and as part of that, a bigger funding pie, resources. You potentially have an opportunity to drive more resources to the in situ side of things. You can channel more funding into bycatch mitigation, into nesting beach conservation. Everybody wins.
Yeah. So we've seen the same thing with buying rainforest to protect it, and that those donors then also support more of the other stuff. It's not a competitive thing. It is that bigger pie. Of course, conservation needs more. We need more pie, but it isn't a competition. I agree with you on that.
Those resources are there. You just have to create the right argument. And the PVA that we did with the IUCN, Conservation Planning Specialist Group, and their team with using the Vortex model was, and we discussed this with Phil Miller in the workshop in 2017, and the whole team was there. I mean, there was, I think, Doug, anyway.
The whole team.
Yeah, the whole IUCN team, and that was our first introduction to Vortex for Upwell. And since then, we've had some a great graduate student who's really taken it to a new level, and we've done a number of PVAs on the source population of Western Atlantic leatherbacks and looked at, okay, which populations could handle usage of a certain percentage of eggs, a small percentage from doomed nest that were laid below the tide line, and it, there are at least 4 where you could do translocation populations where that could be done and readily, and those eggs are easy to transport. You could test the model, see if do turtles behave the way you would expect they would upon release. Do they survive? How well do they survive? It would change our assumptions in the modeling too. We were very conservative when we modeled this, but our models, the modeling effort we did, which has been published, shows that by augmenting the population at a level of, say, 4,000 to 6,000 turtles a year, and coupling that with different bycatch mitigation strategies, you can ensure persistence. Even without changing the bycatch, you can at least have persistence, which keeps you at 0, but not below, and maybe buy some time. But if you could achieve the bycatch reductions alongside the augmentation, you can actually start to see growth of the population, which is where we want to be. So, but if we don't do anything and just keep on keeping on the way we are, there's one thing I think that's pretty certain. You're going to lose first you'll lose the East Pacific leatherback population, and then you'll lose the West. And that's a sad day when you lose an animal like the leatherback, a living dinosaur from the Pacific.
Well, I feel even more optimistic about their future, having chatted with you today and learned more about Upwell's great work. I'm excited to look up some of the things we've talked about and see some of that stuff online. And I hope to see one myself one day. And I just want to say huge thank you to you and your team for everything you do. Thank you for chatting with us today.
Yes.
And I look forward to seeing where things go. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you very much, Sam.